Welcome everyone to another CTC Software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis. I'm the Director of Development here at CTC Software, and in today's session, we're going to be continuing the Nexus CMS Admin Learning Series. We're focusing today on how to configure Revit preview generation settings. And we'll have a little tip for some AutoCAD preview generation settings, or AutoCAD preview settings rather, a little bit later on in this little discussion today. So in case your AutoCAD still applies a little bit at the very end. As always, of course, our webinars are recorded. So certainly feel free to jump on our YouTube channel. If you're watching this on the YouTube channel, that's fantastic. We enjoy if you subscribe to it. That way you get notified when webinars like this get posted. And if you like this video and find it valuable, well, hey, a like is always appreciated as well. Helps the rest of the community find these videos because YouTube thinks y'all like it. Also, as always, we keep our eyes on the questions window throughout the discussion today. So if you have questions about this topic, we do encourage you to throw them into the QA window or the questions window, because we will try to answer those live while we're talking about this topic. Without further ado, let's jump right in. So we've talked a little bit about setting up the Nexus CMS environment. We've talked about making some libraries in our previous session and some user controls and rights and all kinds of stuff. And pretty quickly here, we're going to start talking in depth about adding content in different ways. But before you start adding content to the Nexus CMS, it really is important to make sure you've got your graphic settings set up in a way that help your users identify your content better. So when they're searching, the visual representation of the content is clear. We're talking architecture, maybe you want your doors to appear shaded. Maybe you want that to be in an elevation view, or maybe you don't and you want it 3D. That's fine. Maybe you want your furniture to always be in 3D and realistically rendered, right? It doesn't matter what it is you want. Whatever you want, you can set up with your Revit content. You just have to make sure you think a little bit ahead, which is what we're doing right now. Here, we're going to show you how exactly you can control your preview generation and what the settings are that need to be in place so you get the best representation of your Revit content when you're processing that into the CMS. We're going to cover 4 specific things. We're going to take a look at when family previews are generated. We're going to take a look at some default settings for family preview creation. We're going to customize for specific Revit categories and different host types, so you can really refine how those representations are going to be. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about, in case you don't like the preview at all, or the preview just isn't good, some Revit system families can't have good quality previews set up for them. That's understandable, because Revit doesn't let us do a thing. And perhaps in AutoCAD, you're not getting the previews you want either. That's understandable too. You can manually set explicit previews within the CMS. We're going to take a look at how to do that. First, though, let's control whether preview generation is happening even in the first place. Like, how do we set this up right from the start? And to begin this journey, we're going to start in the portal. Now, we've started by taking a look at settings in detail in a previous session. We talked about this setting, but it wasn't really relevant until right now. So I'm going to go sign into the portal. I'm on ctcsoftware.com, and I'm signed into my Express Tool sort of little demo account here. And I'm going to click on the go to my portal area, which is where it brings me here. And we're going to jump into the CMS sub-tab here, or the sort of CMS portal control, go down into settings, and take a look at the organization settings. All the way down at the bottom right corner, there's a checkbox right here. It says disable automatic preview generation. If you have this unchecked, everything that I'm going to talk about in the first part of this presentation today doesn't affect you because it's already off. It's just turned off, right? If you want any of what we're doing today in Revit to take effect, you need to make sure you do not disable this. Actually, I apologize. I misspoke there. Unchecked means it is not disabled. The check means to disable it. So in my case, it is going to, if I leave this checked and save, it would disable it and it would do nothing. If I leave it unchecked, I guess in its default form, I believe, then it is not disabled and preview generations will take place, will take effect. There is another option down here as well. This determines if it generates a preview on future updates, if there's already a preview in place. You've previously processed a family in, or you explicitly set a preview, it will just, if you check this box and save, it will use that existing preview and it will never replace it with something newly generated. So it will still skip the generation of a preview if the content already exists and if it already has a preview when this is checked, okay? In my case, neither of these are checked because I always want previews to be generated by default from the most recent version of my Revit family content. And in case that content is updating, I don't want to continue to use my existing preview. I want it to replace it with the newest so that it's always up to date. So mine here is always generate a preview and use the settings. So if I hit save here, it saves those settings and everything else that I do will take effect, okay? So the disable automatic preview generation, checking this turns off what we're doing, leaving it unchecked leaves it on, and the use existing turns it off for content that already exists, because all content that already exists would have a preview. Unchecked, everything that we're doing today is always taking effect. So let's take a look at how we can establish default preview settings. So what just happens by default when this is on, what's going on? And everybody has some kind of default settings. You have default settings, I have default settings. Even if you don't change it, they're still there as, well, default settings. And where can you get access to these as a CMS admin? So I'm going to jump into the actual CMS environment here, the content management system itself, and we are going to go to add content, okay? Let me make this a little bit wider, and we'll make it quite a bit wider here. So default settings in here on this little top ribbon, sort of top ribbon here above the selected content window, there is a button for content processor settings. If you click on that, it's going to open up the dialog that's called, well, content processor settings. And within here, there's a special tab for Revit configurations, for Revit settings. And in here, there is a Revit family preview generator settings option where you can go through and start to configure how you want things to appear. This is some general visibility. What does it turn off or on as it's creating previews? And for the appearance settings over here, the default graphical appearance of the content. We're going to start here on general settings. Right at the top here, enable preview visibility. This is a checkbox that you pretty much should always have checked, I think. There are certain things that can only be represented in families, like in 2D families, where you may have like certain things turned off or certain things turned on. You may have multiple options. Maybe a tag has multiple different iterations of certain tag values that can be there or not there or whatever. There's a lot of different things that could happen. And if you just use that visibility toggle in the Revit space and you turn something off, well, it grays it out, but it kind of can look a little muddy if you're trying to build a preview from something when there's text on top of text on top of text. So in Revit, there's a little option that enables preview visibility. So it actually shows you what you will see for that particular type that is active. And when you turn that on, generally speaking, your content looks really good. And so I like to leave this turned on all the time for my content, because especially when I'm doing annotation symbols or 2D detail items or really complex MEP stuff that has multiple visibility settings toggled off and on depending on the option I'm using, it looks good for a preview with whatever the last saved type was. If you're doing sort of like a rendered view or a realistic looking view, smooth edges with anti-aliasing is kind of important there. It makes it look a little bit better than it would otherwise look. You can tell it to forcibly show reference planes, or unchecking this would not show reference planes or reference lines. If your view orientation is an elevation, you might not want to show level lines, and so I like to have those turned off. Or invisible lines, they show up as gray as well. Even if you have preview visibility turned on, invisible lines still show up sort of grayed out. And so I like to have those not show at all. especially for things like doors, where I sometimes have an invisible line that helps control some geometry or helps control the overall boundary of a family. I like to not show invisible lines. Flip controls are something that aren't controlled by the preview visibility. Flip controls for things like doors, when you're flipping one side of the wall or the other, or air terminals to go up or down on something, whatever that might be. Those types of controls, that flip control graphic can show in your preview if you want, if you turn this on, or not if you uncheck it. I like showing just the geometry itself, so I like to not show that. And similarly, room calculation points, especially if you're in a 3D view, I don't like showing that green squiggle graphic out there, so I like to turn this particular feature off myself. Host elements is really important for things like face-based objects in the MEP space. I like to turn off the host element because seeing that isn't really very meaningful. Those host elements often are obscuring the vast majority of the geometry of the object that I'm trying to represent. Or in the case of a door, the door's host is a wall. I don't really need to see the wall. What I want to highlight in that is the door itself. So I like to turn off the host elements. In MEP content, there's also connector objects. You can have those connectors like HVAC duct connectors or pipe connectors, electrical connectors turned off. And that's especially for lighting fixtures and for things like outlets on a wall. Those electrical power connectors are massive. They don't have a diameter control. They're just this big disc with an X going through it, and it doesn't really represent stuff very well. So I like to turn off connector graphics so that the HVAC connectors don't show up in my preview. Some of us leverage these void objects, especially in architecture, to cut holes in things when we place our content. Those void elements by default show up in families even with preview visibility enabled. It still shows those void objects as sort of like a glassy orangey color. I don't like those showing up in my family previews, so I like to turn those off as well. In lighting families, those light sources, they can be a little obnoxious sometimes and be so huge that you can't really see what the element is, especially for something like a 4-inch can light. You see like this 4-inch can, but then you see this huge bloom of the light source down below it. That doesn't really represent super well in my opinion, so I like to turn light sources off. Now, there's another feature here. Some of us have imported geometry as the geometry for our families. Maybe you're doing like an inventor workflow and you have an inventor exported content that you're then bringing into your model. You can tell it to not show imported elements or CAD geometry, imported CAD geometry. I personally don't like using imported geometry if I can avoid it. And so usually I turn that stuff off. But if your entire family or the vast majority of your family is generated based on imported geometry, well, then you need that turned on. You need that visible, otherwise there's nothing to show in some cases. The final option here is setting the background color to white. This is an important one for those of us processing content from Revit 2024 or 2025 if you're using the dark mode version of Revit, where the background by default is black. If you don't check this, then all of your family background graphics, the background that's in the view that we capture, will be black. And that is okay if that's what you want, but generally speaking, a white background for content presentation usually looks a little better within the CMS space. So you might want that color to be set to white, forcing that. Now, there's a note here. This does not apply to rendering displays because it actually creates a rendering, and the rendering background is sort of a gradient gray tone if there's nothing behind it. So, and that also doesn't apply to rendering, especially in plan views. So a plan view orientation may or may not get that color set 100% correctly depending on your graphic representations that you are setting for the other preview settings. But these general settings control a lot of what is visible or not visible within the actual family content itself. The next thing that we're going to take a look at here is in appearance settings. These settings for the default appearance control everything that you're not custom controlling some other way. So by default, if you don't have any other explicit settings for these default established settings here, it's going to look at the view in 3D right front top if it can. This obviously would not apply to annotation symbols or detail items because they don't have any other view other than just the plan view. That's all they've got. So 3D right front top, though, is the default for everything else that's in 3D. And you can customize this to whatever you want. The display style, by default, in my case, is set to realistic. There's a bunch of other options inside of here, like maybe you want this to be shaded or shaded with edges, or you want realistic with edges turned on, or whatever you want. You can set these representations to anything that you see as meaningful. Realistic is nice. It's kind of like a rendering, but it's not a rendering. It's a little bit faster to generate, but it kind of shows some of the materialization on objects if they have materialization. Otherwise, they just show gray. By the way, I didn't drop the list down, but for view angle, you have all of the view cube orientations. Elevation, front, left, right. You've got floor plan views. You've got a ceiling plan view if that's relevant. You've got all the different standard 3D orientations from the different corners, the 8 corners of the cube. Any of these can be an orientation that you can set by default for families that would support that. Again, not the 2D families. You can also force a detail level. A lot of our content shows really simplistically at a coarse and sometimes even medium level of detail. So my personal preference is to show a fine detail level. It gives you the best possible representation of your content, in my opinion. You may have a different opinion. This is why there's options, right? This is why you can control this however you'd like. You can also update whatever you want the display units to be. So if you want things to consistently show things like scales and metric or scales and imperial, you can modify that. And really what this controls is the scale list here. So if I go to metric, then it'll show a scale list for that. And it'll set the scale, even if it's an imperial family, it'll set the scale to a metric scale if that's what you want. Or if you're in imperial, you can set your scale to an imperial scale. Now, what I find is that when I'm showing line weights, like if I'm doing realistic with edges, for example, and line weights are showing up, I don't like to set my scale to one of my standard sort of architectural scales, like 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch or 1/16 inch or whatever, right? Those might be a little bit too coarse to show a fine detail level. Think about the same thing when you're doing detailing in a drafting view, right? If you're going to show something as a fine detail level, it's going to get real muddy at 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch equals a foot. So I like to set my scale someplace down here. Think also, you're talking about a really small object. We're talking about a door. We're talking about maybe even a piece of equipment, which can get kind of big, but still in the grand scheme of things, we're not talking about an entire building. So these higher scales up here, these coarser scales, probably not very meaningful, but you can make whatever choices you want. I personally like something in the realm of 1.5 inches equals a foot or 3 inch equals a foot. That I find gives me pretty reasonable preview graphics. Now, what I would recommend is set your default, run a couple of families, see how they look. If you like it, great. If you don't, change it, rerun it, and then you're good to go. Of course, that depends on what your settings are in the portal for whether you're generating previews in the first place or not. So these are all your typical settings here. And when you save that, anything that doesn't have some special settings will use these default settings for preview generation. Again, assuming you're generating previews in the first place. Well, now let's take a look at defining really custom preview settings, right? Because not everything needs to show at, right front top and show at a super fine detail level. There's sometimes when maybe mechanical equipment, I want to show at a different scale. And I might want to show it in a different way. Or if it's an air terminal, I might want a different orientation for that, like a plan view maybe. Or maybe I do want 3D view still, but I want it maybe looking from the bottom or something. Like there's all different things you could do, right? So how do we control that? Well, back inside the CMS environment here, we're going to go back into content processor settings. I okayed it before, but I did that so I can go back in there and show you once again, how do you get to these processor settings? So it's on the Add Content tab. It's the Content Processor Settings button. You go into Revit settings. Again, this is very Revit centric. We're going to go into Revit Family Preview Generator settings. And the general settings always apply. But over here, back on the Appearance settings, look down below. We can control appearances by category right here. And there's quite a lot of control you have in here. So all of these default appearance settings, we'll see this sort of control set again, but we get to control it in a very filtered, very specific space. So let's say I make a brand new appearance template. You can see I've got a few down here. I've got some for my wall hosted objects. I've got some for my face-based objects, ceiling-based. Detail items have their own representation. I do something very specific with unhosted generic models. They've got a very specific representation there, right? You can have all kinds of different graphic representations here for different types of things, and you do that by making an appearance template. So I'm going to click New here, and that's going to pull up a dialog box. It pulled up on my other screen here, and I'm going to go into the template name. I'm going to give this some kind of a name. Let's call this Webinar Graphics, okay? This is whatever I want this to be. Now, with this appearance template, you can actually, for a discrete category, turn off preview generation entirely. So whatever I put into this particular appearance template, the Nexus CMS will not in any fashion attempt to build a preview. These settings just get turned off for whatever's in here. So generally, by default, things will get a preview, but anything that's in this particular collection, no preview. Alternatively here, maybe I want preview generation turned on, but I want the preview graphic here to be like a floor plan orientation, or I want a back elevation orientation for something like this. And for my display style, maybe realistic doesn't look good on a straight on elevation view. So maybe I want to do something like shaded with edges, and I can show the shading of something instead. I probably still want a fine detail level. In my case, here in the US, I probably still want to be using my imperial display unit so that I can pick an imperial scale. And maybe in this case, if something is wall hosted, it's probably going to be a smaller object. So maybe instead of the default 1.5 inch equals a foot, maybe I want to use 3 inch equals a foot to have just slightly smaller line weights on those items, and just have it appear just a little bit different here for whatever this webinar graphics grouping happens to be. So I can take this appearance template called webinar graphics and click OK, and that will be added to my list of available appearance templates. Nothing's being controlled by it yet, but it does have those settings basically turned on. You can see I've got a few of these other ones up here like detail items. That's a very specific one. I called it based on a Revit category. And if I edit this, you'll see that this is using the floor plan representation. It's using hidden line instead of shaded with edges. It's using a fine detail level. And because detail items are really small, I'm using a 6 inch equals a foot representation for these. I'm not going down to 1:1, but 6 inch equals a foot tends to give me a pretty good representation for detail items discretely, right? And then what I've done is inside of this appearance template, I put detail items. So anything that is a detail item will get this representation. It will completely ignore the default appearance. If it's a detail item, it will do whatever this rule set says. So I'm very specifically customizing how my detail items are being configured. Within the webinar graphics over here, let's just say I go to air terminals. And if I have something that's an air terminal that's completely unhosted, now this would probably be kind of silly to show it as elevation back, but let's just say that's what I wanted. If I have an air terminal that is completely unhosted, it's just a model that I can place however I want. It's not face-based, it's not ceiling-based, it's not wall-based, it's just unhosted. I can put that into this webinar graphics collection by hitting the little green arrow right there. And now if I ever run across something that is air terminals unhosted, it will show up as elevation back, as shaded with edges, fine detail level, 3 inch equals a foot scale. That's what it's going to do for that one discrete thing. Now I'm going to delete this because I don't actually want this webinar graphics collection here. I'm going to delete that out. And when I delete this, you'll notice that air terminals right here, as currently the air terminals unhosted, that air terminals category disappeared from over here. And it disappeared because every variation of air terminals is somehow in one of my other appearance templates. And as I drag one of those objects, or not drag them, but add them to one of these appearance templates over here, it disappears from this left control list right now. So when I delete this particular appearance template, it's going to appear back over here again. That's the only thing that's available there. Notice how air terminals don't have a face-based option. That is because up here in my face-based view template, which if I edit this to show you what my settings are for the face-based view template, it is 3D left front top. It's shaded with edges, fine detail level 3" equals a foot. So it's got my settings for this one, which is a little bit different than 3D right front top and realistic with edges. This one's showing shaded with edges because I probably don't have materials applied. And if I don't have a material applied, it'll just use the default material, which is gray. And maybe I've got something that's like, it's like a white graphic instead of a gray graphic on my stuff if I shade with edges. So like you can control a bit more about how that shows with the materials in the family. But my face-based collection over here, if we take a look at this, let me make this a little bit taller here for you guys. It's not helping me out too much. That's fine. Over here, you can see that pretty much everything that is face-based, air terminals, casework, communication devices, doors, everything, furniture that's face-based, generic models, if it's face-based, I put it into this face-based list. That's why it's called face-based. It's not necessarily just by discipline. I just generically said, man, if it's face-based, it's going to be here, and it's going to show the exact same way no matter what. And they're all going to show that same way. You might want to get a little more granular, and you absolutely can. Again, you can make as many of these appearance templates for different categories and hosting types of your content as you'd like. If we take a look at my wall-hosted objects, let me just edit the settings here for this one as well. In the wall-hosted objects, notice how my view angle is elevation back. I like my wall-hosted things to show straight on from an elevation view. These are typically things like doors or windows or maybe casework if you're wall hosting that, though I probably wouldn't wall host casework. But anything that is actually wall hosted is going to show elevation back orientation. Again, shaded with edges, I mentioned that before. Fine detail level 3" equals a foot. So I have that explicitly set. And so in here, you'll notice that everything that had a wall hosting type associated to it is in this list for pretty much every category that could possibly be wall hosted. I did the same thing for my ceiling hosted. It's got all my ceiling hosting inside of here with its own orientation. And it's got, I don't know, generic models that are unhosted. They show a special way. That's specifically in this generic models unhosted one, which probably shows the exact same as this up here, honestly. Let's see if it does. Oh no, it's just a little bit different. It's actually showing shaded with edges instead of realistic with edges. That's pretty much the main difference. And the scale, I guess, is a little bit different as well. This is 1" equals a foot as opposed to the 3" equals a foot. If it's a generic model, it'll show sort of that way, right? But you can go through and create whatever graphic representations you want. And then when you save these settings, they're applied to the entire organization. Everybody at your firm will be using these exact same content processor settings for the custom preview settings. This means if you're in architecture, you can add to this list your architecture specific settings. And then if somebody else on your team is an MEP or maybe just mechanical, they can do like an HVAC collection of settings. You're all going to be sharing the same things. So no matter who processes content in your firm, they're all processed using the exact same settings. These are organization wide. Okay, so that's custom preview settings, how you can configure that specifically. Now, sometimes when you run a search on content, and let's go do a search here. I'm going to go into my searching. I'm going to intentionally go to my private library here, and I'm going to go to a category like stairs. Okay, these are Revit stair objects. I don't have any stair objects. That's fantastic. Beautiful. I should have probably tested that ahead of time. Let's try railings. Let's see if I have any railings. There we go. Got a railing, right? Sometimes this one here looks good. There's a reason for that. Normally railings show up like this. They have no preview. When we were over there in our preview settings, all of the Revit categories that were listed there were for family categories that are RFAs, Revit families, that can be saved out of a project. Now, the little mounting object here, the little wall bracket, that is an RFA, and that can be used within a railing. But the railing overall, its whole configuration, when we're talking about a system family in Revit, there is no preview control that I can get for a railing that's been drawn in Revit or that has a family in Revit that's a system family. So if Revit doesn't give us one, you get this white preview, and it kind of doesn't present great. Like if I wanted to see this handrail pipe wall or handrail rectangular, I would need to go capture something out of Revit specifically. So what I like to do as I'm loading up these system families or model groups or things that I want discretely a better preview on is I will jump into Revit. I will create myself some kind of a 3D view that shows me the thing, like this little view here if I was doing a stair, or just the railing rectangular itself. So maybe I like hide this so I can kind of focus on the railing over here, maybe get some view orientation that shows that rectangular railing over there that I want to be using. And maybe I do a little print screen of this, or I print to an image or something, right? So I'm going to show just this area. I'll save that. I'm going to actually, it's on my other monitor right now, but I'm going to save this to my desktop here because I'm lazy about that and call this railing rectangular. If I could spell, that would be great. There we go, railing rectangular, and it's just a little PNG image, and it captured sort of what this graphic here is of this railing in use somehow meaningfully in the model. I promised y'all if you happen to be AutoCAD users that I would give you some kind of a tip here as well. If you're in AutoCAD and you want a very specific preview of something that is AutoCAD centric, maybe you're doing Civil 3D and you want to show a better representation of an actual tag of maybe an alignment tag. You can do the drawing, have the alignment tag in the plan, and take a screenshot of it from AutoCAD. Make your background white though when you do it. It's going to look better in Nexus. But take a screenshot of that and save that screenshot someplace. And then for each piece of content, you, the admins, when you process that in, if you need a special representation, if I want to show that graphic here, you can right click on any piece of content and you can go to Assign Custom Preview Image and go browse for where that stuff is. So if I go here to my desktop where I've saved that preview, where is that? Stairs, railing rectangular, here we go. That railing rectangular thing is going to update. It's going to take a few seconds for it to actually that was actually supposed to be this guy, but that's fine. Whatever. I can do it here too. Assign custom preview image, and I'll pick the other one. I'll pick the stairs PNG out there. It does take a little bit. It's not going to be immediate to immediately update, but in about 60 seconds, in about, maybe 5 minutes or so, when you run that search, and in my case, it happened darn near immediately, that is the preview that now graphically shows for that content. You can set that. You absolutely can. So for things where you want that custom preview, capture one and set it. It doesn't always have to be automatic. Sometimes you might want something specific. Now, if you're doing this kind of thing frequently, if you're manually capturing a preview, you may, let's go back to our first little step here, you may want to go back into the portal and more consistently use the existing preview by default, unless you know when you're processing content that you want to enable automatic preview generation. This way, if you use the existing preview and you save this, when you next process that same railing, if I reprocess any of this, it will not replace the work that I've gone through to do to set my manual, very intentional previews. So you have that choice of doing that with your setting, just using the existing preview there. Then when you reprocess and add content, it won't refresh it. Just understand that it won't refresh it. So if your graphics changed significantly in your family, you might need to manually set a new preview if that's the choice that you're using. Or if you're going to process a bunch of Revit families and you know you want the previews to update, uncheck this, use existing preview before you run the process, and then come back and turn this back on so you don't accidentally reset stuff in the future. This is sort of an organization-wide setting though, so you do want to make sure you're paying attention to it. But that is how you can go through, oh, and I didn't slide my slide forward here. That's how you can go through and override previews on demand. You can, as an admin, you can go in there and do this. Now, regular daily designers, the end user of this in your firm, they don't have that ability to override the previews. The only way that they can do that is if they are a content management admin or they're a library manager. You can set that up for people so that library managers can go in there and help you establish your previews if you want to. But that is required for you to be able to use that little right click preview setting. All right, I've gone through quite a bit of detail here today about how to go through and manage your preview generation for Revit content, and one little tip there for the AutoCAD side as well. We hope that you found this information meaningful and that you can implement this as you're getting ready to process content into the Nexus CMS. So with that, I'm going to say for those of you watching this as a recording, thank you. We always appreciate when you show up and take a look at our presentations here on the YouTube. And again, if you found this valuable, we hope that it earns a like from you and maybe a subscribe so you get these kinds of things in the future.